Check, 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 check. Check one, two. Check, check.
Welcome in, everybody. Welcome to the Hot Shop today. My name is Jeremy. I'll be your MC. Like Jabari said, if you have any questions, please let me know. It's a lot easier for me to answer your questions than it is to read off the papers here. We got a couple of different things going on in the Hot Shop today. Here in our center bench, we have the Museum of Glass Hot Shop team doing some production work. If you look off to your right-hand side over here, we're making these water pitchers for Pride Month. In this particular case, they're adding the handle to the pitcher right now. They're going to attach it there. Give it a quick little blast with that hot torch. Oh, opted a bent. All right, so that big orange tube that Gabe is standing in front of, that's called the rewarming station. We also call it a G-hole or a glory hole. That G-hole runs at 2,100 degrees from the time we get here in the morning until we leave in the afternoon. Just to the right side of that, you'll see a big silver looking machine with a door on it. That's called our crucible. We have 2 of them here in the Hot Shop. Each one of those crucibles holds 1,000 pounds of glass at 2,100 degrees, 24/7. Can we see the diagram of both the G-hole and the crucible? So you see Nick there in the center bench with a hot torch, putting a little bit of focused energy right on the very edge of that vase. Gives it the pour spout. Gabe is using the big fluffy torch to keep everything up to temperature. And very soon we'll be ready to knock this pitcher away and put it into our cooling machines, our annealers, till tomorrow. You see over on the left-hand side of the studio, Nick has got the tongs. Looks like we're getting ready to break the pitcher away. Gabe is giving a little bit more attention to that connection point between the pitcher and the pipe. Pretty soon you'll see him reach behind him, get a little bit of water, add that water on the connection point, and with a quick tap, he'll separate it from the pipe and we can put it away for the evening. But before he does that, we're going to get it back into the rewarming chamber, try and get an all-over temperature that's acceptable for the artist so we don't lose that piece of art. Here goes your water. Now Nick is going to grab that pitcher, and Gabe with the backside of those jacks will give a tap to the pipe and separate it. The hot torch right on the end. Melt all of that chipped and broken glass away. You're going to emboss it with the Museum of Glass logo there in the bottom. And then off to the annealer where it'll cool down overnight. The question was, how hot does the G-hole get? The G-hole, or the rewarming station, is 2,300 degrees. The annealers we bring up to about 1,000 degrees, and we maintain them there during the day. And like I said, once we are shut down for the evening, we push the run button on the computer on the side, and it will bring the temperature from 1,000 degrees down to room temperature overnight-ish. On the right-hand side of the studio, you'll see Nick is lining up a colored cane. If you can see the item that I'm holding here, this is just a simple piece of glass stretched out into a long, thin cane. You're gonna line those up on that plate, and then as Sarah finishes blowing the bubble up to the right size here at the center, she'll roll the bubble across those canes, picking them up on the outside of the glass. So we'll watch that process. All right, so if you can see up on the main screen, that is that's an image of the hot plate that Nick has put together over on the right-hand side. We've got the canes lined up and ready for that bubble pickup as soon as Sarah is ready. Sarah is coming out of the crucible with a new gather of hot glass. She's going to sit down here at the bench and going to form that glass up a little bit before we take a run and do that cane pickup. You notice the tool that Sarah's using, it's called a block. It's made out of wood, and the reason that we use wood instead of some other material like metal is that wood absorbs the moisture of the water from the bucket that it's sitting in, and when the hot glass gets close to the surface of the wood, it provides a layer of steam for that glass object to ride very smoothly on. That's how we're able to get that perfectly glassy finish. When you look at it compared to some of the things like over here in the left-hand bench, as they go into these molds, you'll see that the surface of those geometric objects is not as smooth as the bubbles that we're working here. That's because it's chilling against another object. You see how it's kind of shimmery? Those are called chill marks. So the steam that is provided by the tools that we use here, the wooden ones and the papers, allow that surface to be perfectly smooth. You notice here at the center bench, Sarah is using that stack of newspaper to shape that bubble and cool off the outside. Gives it a nice solid finish, sets that bubble up so that we can get another layer of glass on the outside, make our object even bigger. We got to let that bubble set up so that when we put it back into the crucible, the heat from the crucible doesn't collapse the bubble, ruining our efforts there at the end of the pipe. All right, Sarah's going back into the crucible, get another gather of glass on the outside of that bubble. And at the same time, Nick is taking that Steinert plate of glass cane, putting it into the right side rewarming station. Knowing that hot glass only sticks to hot glass, we've got to make sure that they're the proper temperature so that when Sarah starts rolling, the glass will actually adhere to the outside of that bubble. Now, from time to time, that blowpipe gets really, really hot, so Sarah's brought it over to the pipe cooler. Basically, it's just a water bath that we're able to rotate the pipe through, cool it off. Allows us to get our hands closer to that connection point, makes things easier when walking around the studio with big gathers of hot glass on the end. You notice that she measured against some calipers to make sure the bubble was the right size so that everything comes out even. Do a quick roll across that plate. And get it back here to the center bench, do a little bit more work on it. And then we'll get it into the rewarming station to get all of those little canes nice and hot, melted into the surface of that bubble. She's rolling that bubble back and forth on the table. That table is called the Marver. She rolls it back and forth to press those canes into the surface of that bubble. And then back into the rewarming chamber to get everything nice and moving. It's a slow and careful process to make sure that those canes are adhered properly. And Sarah's handed off the object to Gabe. And Gabe will be taking that bubble back to the bench, closing it off, and bringing all of those colors together in a nice convergence point up at the tip. So back to the bench with Gabe. You can see that he's using that tool called the jacks to bring all of those canes to a single point at the top. I'm going to use the shears there, kind of neck it down a little bit more and get it ready to knock that big glob off the end. One of the questions we get asked an awful lot is, with the glass that ends up on the floor, what do you do with it? Do you throw it away? Do you recycle it? Well, if the glass that we have on the end of the pipe stays uncolored, has no contamination from the dirt or anything from the floor or tables, then we're able to take it and put it straight back into the crucible. However, if it is like you saw here when they knocked it off, it's got color rods attached to the outside of it. Unfortunately, that's unusable and will go in the garbage. With the way these objects are being constructed, it's kind of from the bottom up. If you look at the picture that I'm holding right now, currently the glass pipe is attached to the top end up here. Here pretty soon, once we've got a form that we're happy with, we're going to create another stick, another punty, and we're going to transfer that object to the other punty so we can open it up and work on the mouth. Right now we've got Sarah giving a little bit of a little breath to that to the pipe, blowing it up a little bit. And as a glass artist, one of the most important things that you learn is to keep that connection point between the glass and the pipe above 1,000 degrees. That connection point is called the moil. And that moil, it does exactly what you think it is. It connects that glass object to the pipe. And if it drops below 1,000 degrees, it will crack, and all of that hard work will end up on the floor. So from time to time, they use that big fluffy torch you see burning behind Gabe. Other times, they'll put the entire object into the rewarming station and do it that way. Thanks for stopping in, guys. And feel free to come back as soon as you can. Good morning, welcome in. My name is Jeremy. I'm the MC here on the floor today. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to answer for you. We've got a couple of things going on today. And so the Hot Shop team here in the center bench is centered up that punty, getting ready to transfer the pitcher onto it. Using a little bit of water, we use the connection point. A little tap, we'll snap that off. Into the rewarming chamber. That rewarming chamber comes in at 2,300 degrees. That runs from when we get here in the morning till when we close up at night. To the right-hand side of that rewarming station, we have a crucible. We've got another one over on the left-hand side of the studio. Each one of those crucibles holds 1,000 pounds of glass at 2,100 degrees, 24/7. It runs on natural gas and forced air. Gabe here at the center bench has taken that pitcher form, put it all the way into that rewarming station, trying to get the surface of that glass up to a nice, even, uniform temperature. Then he'll back it out a little bit, and he'll focus the energy from the blowtorch effects of that rewarming station right at the very end, making that nice and soft so that we can then form up the lip and the pour spout of the pitcher. And Gabe has brought that form back to the bench, and he's using the jacks, a metal tool in his hand, to open up the mouth of that pitcher ever so gently while Nick shields him with those paddles. And back into the rewarming station. And keep the end of that pitcher nice and malleable so that when they bring it back, we can put the pour spout in. On the right-hand side, you'll see Sarah going into the crucible. She's getting a gather of hot glass. That's all clear. She'll do that a couple of times, enough so that we have glass on the end of that, just enough to make the handle for the pitcher. Back to that big metal table called the Marver. You're going to roll it out and elongate that, that gather of glass. All right, so we watched the bottom portion of that handle get attached. Gabe is going to attach that top portion, shape out the handle while Nick applies that hot torch to the connection. Make sure that everything is nice and tight. And that hot torch there, the reason we call it the hot torch is because it is the hottest thing in the hot shop, about 5,000 degrees when it's rolling full out. Looks like Gabe is going back into the reheating station for one more quick flash, get a surface temperature as uniform as possible. And then using that technique we saw a little earlier, grab a little bit of water, put on the connection point, and we'll bonk that away once Nick has grabbed onto the pitcher itself. Application of that hot torch there at the bottom. Going to melt in all of that glass that was used to connect the two, and then we're going to emboss the Museum of Glass logo into the bottom. Over into the cooling oven where it will sit overnight, and most likely you'll see that elsewhere in the Museum of Glass later on. All right, the Hot Shop team is going to take a brief break now while they set up for the next pitcher. You notice here, Nick is taking those glass canes, laying them out in the appropriate pattern here. Once he gets the pattern set, he's going to go over to that hot plate there on the right-hand side of the studio and lay those canes down. He's going to lay them out in a specific width. And that width corresponds to the width in the calipers that you see sitting on the Marver, the very edge. Making sure that once we do that roll up, all of those canes are applied to the outside of the bubble equally. See Sarah really focusing on that moil, making sure that connection point is as strong as possible, and then pushing the excess glass off the end of the rod so that she will have enough glass to make a bubble. Little puff and cap right there. You see that bubble very slowly. And we'll see Sarah sit at this bench for just a little bit longer than normal. She's going to let that bubble set up so it's nice and cool, relatively speaking, of course. But once that bubble's at the appropriate temperature, Sarah's going to go back into that crucible and grab another gather of hot glass so that we have enough on the end of that pipe to make that pitcher form. The reason she's taken as much time at the bench as she is, so that when we go back into the crucible, that bubble will have set up enough so that it doesn't implode under the heat and the weight of the new glass that's added to the outside. Now to shape the outside of that object, Sarah's using a tool called the block. That block is made from a fine-grained, usually a fruit wood like cherry or apple. The block does something special in that it holds the water in that bucket behind her. And when it comes in contact with the glass, it creates a layer of steam for that glass bubble to ride on. Allows us to have that perfectly shiny, glassy finish that you're so used to seeing without leaving behind any of those nasty chill marks. We get asked from time to time what that pad is that Sarah's using, and that is actually newspaper folded up and soaked in water. It does a similar thing for us that the blocks do, in that it holds the water and allows that cushion of steam to form once it's applied to the glass. We like to use them because they're more malleable, and we can apply some very specific cooling to very specific areas in order to make the bubble blow up the way we want it to. Sarah's measuring against the calipers there to make sure that the bubble is big enough so that it matches the canes that Nick has got over there on the right-hand side. We're letting that bubble set up just a little bit more, rolling it back and forth on the marber. Sarah's going to go get another gather of hot glass. And at the same time, Nick is going to take that Steinert plate, put it in his rewarming chamber down there. They're going to bring both items together, and Sarah will roll those glass canes onto the outside of the bubble. We'll watch that process happen now. All right, she let it set up nice and cool, going back in for another gather of hot glass. Again, Nick has taken his plate with those canes, put it in that rewarming chamber over on the right-hand side. What Sarah's doing there is what's called a strip gather. When she goes in there, she's got an excess amount of glass on there, and so by hanging it over that silver bucket, she's able to let gravity pull that off the edge. And now she'll take it over to the pipe cooler, basically just a water bath. It's going to cool that pipe down, make it a lot easier for us to get our hands close or further down the pipe, closer to the object, which in the end makes it a lot easier to carry around the glass studio. Come back and measure against the calipers. And Nick is out with that hot plate of cane. And here we go with a color cane roll-up. And there you have it, folks. That's just one way that we get colors onto our clear glass. So you see Nick, or excuse me, not Nick. Nick is shielding. We've got Gabe here in the hot seat in the center bench. I'm using that metal tool called the jacks to bring all of those canes together into a convergence point at the top. And using those diamond shears, he's going to get rid of that excess lump there at the end. So if you think about the way things are produced, the reason that we have cut away so much glass at the bottom is that those canes, when we do the roll up, they don't come together at a specific point. They're just kind of all over the place. So by necking it down and bringing all of them together, we're able to get that convergence where all the swirls come together in the same spot. So that's why they did that. They're working currently on the bottom, and pretty soon they're going to attach another punty to the opposite end. You'll see that happen. But for now, so again, Gabe here at the center bench is using that tool called the jacks to create the jack line, which will be the break-off point when we get ready to separate this pitcher. And then back to the papers to cool off the bubble and shape it up just a bit more. Do that for another few seconds, and then we'll get back into that rewarming chamber. Heat the glass back up again. You notice Gabe has focused the energy from that rewarming station right at the very base of the pitcher. And they're forming up the bottom right now, getting it nice and flat, shaping up the outside. Once he's happy with that, we'll get it back into the rewarming chamber for what we call a flash. While they're getting ready with that, Sarah has grabbed a punty, getting a small gather of glass on that, and she'll form that up and attach it to the bottom of the pitcher that we're working on. Adding a little extra glass there to the bottom at the connection point so that the pitcher isn't compromised. Looked a little thin to the artist. And melt it back into the surface. And as Gabe finishes that up, Nick will then build that punty where we can transfer the object from one pipe to the other. All right, we're attaching the punty to the center of the pitcher there at the bottom. And you'll see very soon Gabe will reach behind him with those tongs, grab some water and apply it to the jack line just off the end of his blowpipe. And then using physics, he'll give that pipe a little bit of a tap. And the surface cracks that were created by the glass or by the water on the glass will go all the way through, separating one object from the other, leaving the pitcher there in Nick's capable hands. Back into the rewarming station, get everything back up nice, hot, and spicy so that we can continue to work and open the end, make the pour spout, and add the handle. Hey guys, welcome in. My name is Jeremy. I'm the MC on the floor today. If you have any question, please raise your hand. I'll do everything in my power to answer. Just as a primer for what's going on here in our center bench, we've got our Museum of Glass Hot Shop team. This is Gabe Feenan in the black hat, Nick with the bald head, and we've got Sarah in the blue shirt over there. Over here in our left bench, we have Richard Royal. Richard Royal is working on some geometric forms for another project that he's got going on. Like I said, if you have questions about either side, let me know, and I'll do what I can to answer them for you. Right here at the center bench, they're working on putting in the pour spout for our Pride event water pitchers. Going to go back into that rewarming station. That rewarming station runs at 2,300 degrees for the time that we're in the studio. You notice on the right-hand side, Nick has got the tongs. That's a good indicator that we're getting pretty close to knocking this piece off and putting it away in our annealers for the evening. What Gabe is doing is he's applying a little extra heat to the connection point between the glass and the pipe. Once he's happy with the temperature, we're going to go back into the rewarming station, get one more all-over heat, and then he's going to reach behind him using a pair of tongs, get a few drops of water, and apply the drops of water at the very base, the connection point of that pitcher. He'll give it a little tap after Nick grabs it with those tongs, and then we will flame polish the bottom, emboss the Museum of Glass logo, and then put it away in the right-hand side annealer for the evening. So that very hot torch that Sarah's got right there, about 5,000 degrees. There's the water I talked about. Flame polishing that break-off point. Here comes the embossing of the logo. And Sarah's going to move to open the door while Nick puts the item away. The question was, is it cold in there? Absolutely not. Yeah, I'll dime you out, no problem. So the inside of those boxes is about 1,000 to 1,100 degrees. It's hot enough to keep our objects from being cold. It's hot enough to keep them from being cold without allowing them to be brittle. And then at the end of the day, we'll hit the button on the side of the machine, the computer brain runs and brings that temperature from 1,000 degrees down to room temperature over the course of the evening. So these items should be cold enough to take out of the annealer tomorrow when we get here for work. You notice that Nick is moving over to that hot plate. It's called a Steinert plate, and he's laying those color canes down in order. They know exactly how wide to make the bubble, and consequently how wide they need to line out those color canes in order to make the wrap happen. So over here in the left-hand bench, you notice that Richard Royal is using that fluffy torch to apply some extra love to the outside of his geometric forms. The reason he's doing that is to get the outside of that object nice and hot so that when he puts it in that mold, the glass will flow to all of the corners and give him the most precise representation of the inside of that mold. I'm going to open up the annealer on the left-hand side of the studio. Richard's going to go in there and knock that piece away. Like I said, we're sitting at about 1,000 degrees right there. And then over the course of the evening, once we're done here in the hot shop, we'll hit the button on that computer brain and we'll be able to pull those objects out tomorrow morning. Now here in the center bench, I've been told that we're moving away from these pitchers. We're going to go with the same type of decoration, but we're going to blow them out into a bowl instead of a pitcher. So similar in the way they construct everything, it's just the way they finish it will be a little different. So you notice that Sarah is sitting there at the center bench with the bubble on the end of that blowpipe. It looks like she's seemingly doing nothing, but what she's doing is very important. She's letting that bubble cool down so it's got a rigid outside. That way when she goes into our crucible, the heat and the weight of all of that fresh glass will not collapse that bubble. It's got a little structural integrity. So she's letting it finish cooling. You'll notice she'll go back to that crucible to the right of our G-hole. That crucible, we have two here on the hot shop floor, those big silver buckets, or big silver pots, I guess you could call them. Each one of those pots holds 1,000 pounds of clear glass at 2,100 degrees, 24/7. Now that crucible differs from our rewarming station. The rewarming stations are those big orange glowing circles you see in front of you. Those rewarming stations have no glass inside of them, and they run at about 2,300 degrees. And we have those there so we can continue to push heat back into our object. That way it doesn't get too cold. As a new glass artist, you will learn that one of the most important things is to keep that connection point between the blowpipe and your artwork at the appropriate temperature. So right at about 1,000 degrees is when things start to go sour. So you drop below that threshold, you risk having that moil, that connection point, crack and then lose all of your hard work. So you'll see the artists from time to time will either get up and go back into the rewarming station, or they'll turn the fluffy torch onto that connection point. Sarah is now using that wooden tool called the block. Blocks are most often made out of a fine-grained fruit wood, apple or cherry usually. And the block does something special for us. The wood holds the moisture from the water in the bucket behind the artist. And when the glass comes close to the surface of that wood, it produces a layer of steam that the glass can ride on. That layer of steam is important because it allows the glass to cool just a bit, shape it up, but it has that nice, perfectly smooth, glassy finish. You can see the way that glass cools here on the left bench by putting it into those molds. You get a shimmery surface. It's not nearly as shiny as what we get here at the center bench. And letting that bubble set up just a bit. Going to measure it against the calipers on the table to make sure that it is the right diameter. And then Sarah's going to let that bubble set up just a little bit more, again giving that structural integrity so that when she goes and adds more glass to the outside, it doesn't collapse under the weight and heat. At the same time she does that, Nick is going to take his plate and put it into the rewarming station there on the right-hand side of the studio. And as long as Sarah is happy with the amount of glass that she's got, the temperature of the pipe, and the diameter of that bubble, she'll roll the bubble back and forth across those canes, adding the color to the outside of our form. Just like I said, Sarah's going in for another gather of hot glass. At the same time, Nick is taking that Steinert plate and putting it deep inside that rewarming chamber. Hot glass only sticks to hot glass, and that's why we've got to get them close to each other in temperature. You notice Sarah is using gravity to strip off the extra glass that's on the outside of that bubble. It's what we call a strip gather. And now she's moving over to the pipe cooler, just a water bath that we lay the pipe in. Cools it off, allows us to get our hands a little closer to the end of that pipe, makes it easier to move around the studio. As she finishes up there, we'll notice that Nick is going to come back to that right-hand bench and lay the plate down. Sarah's going to measure that bubble against the calipers there on the table. And as long as she's happy with that, she'll roll that up. And then back to the center bench to work a couple of little minor adjustments. And as long as she's happy with that, we'll continue to shape it up. Back into the rewarming station to get all of those solid glass canes nice and liquidy so they bend and shape and form into the outside of that bowl. Then using that nice hot plate, well, not hot now, but it's hot sometimes, using that marver to press the glass canes into the outside of that bubble. And then back into the rewarming station. You notice there at the center bench on that marver, Gabe is using the force of friction to twist the outside of that bubble. And continuing to use that marver to press the canes into the outside of the bubble itself. Favorite sound ever. It's like fingers on a chalkboard. The reason it makes that sound when he goes into that mold, and it doesn't make that sound when he's sitting at the bench, is because that mold is completely dry. The tools here at the bench are coated in beeswax, which allows them to flow a little easier and doesn't make that noise. So Gabe just closed off the top of that bubble, bringing all of those colored canes into a swirly connection point, just like you see here at the bottom of the pitcher. This one will be a bowl. But the reason that they do that is so all of the canes come together into that single point on the bottom. Looks a lot better, looks a lot nicer. So that pad that Gabe was just using right there, that is exactly what it looks like. It is a stack of newspapers. That stack of newspapers is soaked in water. And much like I said before, the water that we have on the tools, whether it be the block or the papers, gives us a nice layer of steam for our object to rest in as we shape it up. Gives it a nice glassy, smooth finish without leaving any chill marks in the surface of our form. Gabe is using a tool called the jacks. That jack is putting in a constriction just off the end of the pipe. As we get it nice and spicy here, we'll bring it back to the bench and we'll get that jack line formed. That jack line will serve as the break-off point between our object and the next pipe that we'll transfer it to. Oh, okay. Okay, I've been corrected. We are going to do a pitcher this time instead of a bowl. Bowls will come next. Just going back into that rewarming station for an all-over heat called a flash real quick. But then he's going to focus the energy of that rewarming station right at the very base of the pitcher. Going to make it nice and soft. That way we can bring it back to the bench. Using the paddle and the jacks, we'll put a very nice flat bottom on our pitcher. So Gabe is forming the outside of the pitcher while Sarah forms the bottom. Refining the outside of that shape. And marking the center using a piece of broken glass there. Gives it a little bit of a scratch in the surface so we know where the center is. We add our glass and our punty in the exact spot that we need it. Sarah went there to the crucible, grabbed a little bit of hot glass. They're going to apply that to the bottom, give it a little bit something thicker when they attach to the next pipe, so that we don't have to worry about the item breaking when we snap it away and put it away for the evening. So Gabe is going back into the rewarming chamber. Get another heat. Shape it up just a bit more. While Nick on the far side, over there on the right-hand side of the bench, prepares what's called a punty. That punty is a solid rod with a little bit of glass on the end of it, and they will use that to attach to the bottom of this pitcher. They will then separate the pitcher from the blowpipe and then focus on opening up the mouth and building the pour spout. So over to the cooling bath for the rod. Then back to the Marver, where Nick will form up the glass. So as a young artist, a beginning student of glass, you learn very early that the connection point between the glass and the pipe, it's called the moil. You learn that that is your lifeline, and you maintain that at about 1,000 degrees. If you don't, the glass will crack and you'll lose everything off the end of that pipe. So now we've attached our punty to the center, to the bottom of that pitcher form. Once Gabe is happy with its position and its connection, he'll reach behind him, grab a few drops of water, put that water on the jack line that we talked about earlier, and then using another wooden handle, he will tap the pipe and separate the item from the blowpipe, and then Nick will take that into the rewarming station, focusing the energy on the part of the glass that has been thus far the coldest. I'm going to refine that connection point, make sure everything's on center, everything's spinning properly, and then back into the rewarming station to focus the energy of that right at the very end so we can open up the pitcher. Using that jack tool, opening the mouth of the pitcher up ever so gently. Back into the rewarming station. You see here just to the right of Gabe, Sarah is going into the crucible, going to gather up some hot glass that will then turn into the handle of our pitcher. And Sarah's got that handle material coming out to Gabe. Drawing that handle out just a little bit. And Gabe will then tack the top portion of that down. Shape up the handle. And it looks like he's going back to the rewarming station and get another all-over heat. One of the next things they're going to do here is they're going to make the pour spout. You notice Nick from time to time picks up that small torch. We call that our hot torch. It runs at about 5,000 degrees. Give us an ability to really focus some heat energy into our piece. In this particular case, we will make sure that the handle is attached as securely as possible, and then we'll focus that energy to where we'll draw out the pour spout. All right, so that is about it for that pitcher. I'm going to do a couple more refinements to it, make sure everything is right, make sure that the temperature is accurate, proper. Last couple of things we're going to do here. Gabe is going to make sure that it's the good temperature. Nick has got the tongs. And Sarah will be assisting as well. Pretty soon we're going to knock that pitcher off. I'm going to use the hot torch to melt in any of the broken glass that's on the bottom of it. And then we'll emboss the Museum of Glass logo into the bottom of the pitcher before we put it into our annealing oven on the far hand right side of the studio. Using that water to create some surface cracks. We'll invert it and knock the pitcher off onto the pad. Hot torch to focus some of that energy at the bottom while we get the embossing tool. There goes the Museum of Glass logo. And into the annealer we'll go for the evening. Should come out tomorrow morning. Ready to go. So here on the right-hand side of the studio, you notice that Sarah is letting that bubble on the end of her blowpipe chill. Is going back into the crucible to grab another gather of hot glass on the outside of that bubble. While at the same time, Nick takes our Steinert plate covered in colored cane and puts it in the rewarming station on the right-hand side. Hot glass only sticks to hot glass, so we've got to get those two temperatures close enough that they bond. As Sarah finishes with that strip gather, letting all of the excess clear glass pour off the end of the bubble, she'll move over to the pipe cooler, basically just a water bath wherein we rotate the pipe, cools it down, lets us get our hands closer to the object on which we're working. Then she'll come back here to the table, measure the size of that bubble against the calipers, and if it is within reason, then Sarah will roll that clear bubble of hot glass across those canes that Nick just brought out of the rewarming station. And that is how we get the color on the outside of this particular bubble. Right to that rewarming station, get those canes nice and soft.
That's a birthday card.
Back to the rewarming station to heat up that bubble form. That rewarming station itself runs at 2,300 degrees for the duration that we're here in the studio during the day. Just to the right of that rewarming station, behind Nick here, we have a crucible. We have one on the other side of the studio as well. Each of those crucibles will hold 1,000 pounds of clear glass at 2,100 degrees, 24/7. And those crucibles run on forced air and natural gas. The tactile, they've got to be able to feel the pipe. Sorry? Yeah, they've done it a couple of ways. Gabe started out straight. Here at the center bench, we're blowing that bubble up just a little bit more. You notice that Gabe is using that pad. That pad is actually newspaper soaked in water. And much like the wooden tools, the blocks that you see in the buckets behind the artist, that newspaper pad does something special. It allows the water that is contained within it to form that cushion of steam that our glass object will ride against, leaving behind a perfectly smooth finish. The tool that Gabe is currently using here at the center bench, that's called the jacks, and he's putting in what's called a jack line. That jack line will serve as the break-off point when we get ready to move this bowl form to our punty a little later on. But that constriction, as I said, will serve as the break-off point a little bit later. We've got to get it put in now while it's still hot on that portion of the glass. And once he's happy with that form, he's going to get it back into the rewarming station, get it back up to temperature, and continue working on the form. I'm going to score the bottom here just a little bit so we've got a a good indicator of where to add our extra glass to the bottom of this bowl form. A big glob of clear glass on the bottom. It'll then shape up to make the bottom of the bowl nice and thick. Hopefully that'll provide years and years of enjoyment. Here on the right-hand side, you'll notice Nick has picked up one of those pipes. He's going to turn it into a punty. What he's going to do is he's going to go into our crucible, get a small gather of glass at the very end of that pipe that he's cooling right now. He's going to shape it up into a little bullet point, and then he's going to attach the bowl, or he's going to attach that punty to the bottom of the bowl. Once that's happened, Gabe will reach behind him with his tongs, get some drops of water in between the jaws, and he will apply that water to the jack line, that we talked about earlier. The water, once it hits the surface of that glass, creates some surface cracks, and with a quick tap of a tool, we can use the vibration to make those cracks go all the way through the glass, separating it from the blowpipe on which it's sitting now, leaving it with Nick on the end of that punty. Back into the rewarming station so we can get those two differing pieces of glass up to about the same temperature so they'll stick together. A little bit more refinement here at the bench while Nick finishes up building that punty. And once the artist is happy with the temperature of both, he'll bring them together and knock that bowl off, leaving it with Nick. Finding center with that punty, making sure everything turns on the same axis. And when Gabe is happy with the connection there, he'll reach behind him for that water we talked about. Just that quick, folks. All right, back into the rewarming station. Now, as a point of note, the portion of the bowl that is in the G-hole right now is also the coldest portion of the glass, since it just came off the pipe, being the last thing in and the first thing out of that G-hole when we go back to get a little bit of heat on it. And again, making sure that everything is turning on axis. You notice Gabe has really focused the energy of that rewarming station at the very end of this bowl form, allowing him to open up the mouth of the bubble right now, and then eventually opening it up into a bowl that we are a lot more used to seeing. And take a number of trips back and forth between the rewarming station and the bench in order to make that happen. All right, so Sarah is currently warming up a bit of clear glass. She'll bring it back and present it at the bench here to Gabe. We'll then do a wrap around the mouth of this bowl. And back into the rewarming station to equalize all those temperatures and to form that newly added piece of clear glass into the lip. The tool that Nick just used right there is called a Sophietta. It's a small puffer. It allows us to push air into a bubble or into a form that would otherwise be inaccessible because it is no longer on a blowpipe, it's on a solid rod. And so by pushing that Sophietta into the end, you're able to seal it up and push more air in, blow it out into a bowl. Using those jacks, again, very, very lightly open that up. We moved on. We're no longer with the jacks. We are using now a tool called the Parchofis. And they're similar to the jacks in that they have jaws, but instead of metal blades, they are wooden blades. Again, using those newspapers to cool down very specific areas of glass, form it up exactly as the artist wants it. Now remember, folks, the water in those newspapers provides that steam, cushion of steam for the glass to ride on, allowing us to have a perfectly smooth finish on the outside. I'd imagine they're probably up there pretty high, yeah. Okay. Over here on the left-hand side of the studio, we have Richard Royal, who's working on some personal projects, geometric forms, if you will. When he goes into the crucible, he's gathering a layer of clear glass on the outside of the bubble that he's already working. And by hanging it upside down, he's allowing all of the excess to flow off and into a recycle bucket. So he's minimizing the clear layer of glass on the outside of the color that he has already added. Does that make sense? All right, off the right-hand side of the studio, you see Nick getting his fancy dancing clothes on. That's a good indicator that we're getting ready to put away this bowl. The black box right behind Nick, that's an annealer. It's about 1,000 degrees on the inside. And when we leave in the evening, we'll hit the brain button on the side of the box, and the computer program will run that 1,000 degrees down to room temperature over the course of the evening. So Nick is getting all of his protective gear on, so he's ready to catch, if you will, catch the bowl when Gabe is ready to knock it away. And then he'll run over and put it away in that annealer, as I said. Using a little bit of that water on the base, we'll create those surface cracks. And with a bonk on the end of that blowpipe and knock it away, leave it in Nick's hands. We'll flame polish the bottom and emboss the Museum of Glass logo into it. And once they're done with that, off to the right-hand side of the studio to put it away for the evening. Let's hear a round of applause for that one, guys. All right, folks. For the Museum of Glass Hot Shop team here in the center bench, we're going to do lunch. Be back in about an hour. I'd like to see you back when you can.